can you bring us up to speed with what's been happening more recently? Like what have you learned through Huddle that's kind of different than the habituation model? And I can also speak to that a little bit.
Mhm. So more recently, what I've been learning is that you're not actually trying to make your intrusive thoughts go away or the anxious sensations, but just changing your perspective of how you think of them and um, like going more towards accepting them. And that was a really new idea to me when I learned it. Um, and also, I was thinking about it today, and even when I started Huddle, like whenever a few months ago, um, I had the idea at that time that I was working towards like being in recovery, which would be like no intrusive thoughts and no anxious sensations. And my view has totally changed now. Like every day I still have intrusive thoughts or like anxious sensations, and I'm still learning so much every day. But I think I have really started to get like a much closer to accepting it all. Like some days are better than others, but my idea of recovery is so different now. So,
Really happy to hear that. Can you describe what your idea of recovery is?
mhm. um, yeah. So I think it's just like kind of like what I kind of already said. So just being accepting every day of whatever thoughts and sensations come or emotions because um lately my intrusive thoughts have been less, but I'm been working a lot on like emotional perfectionism and my just right OCD. um so working a lot on like accepting my emotions and feelings as well because that is also kind of new to me.
Yeah. Can you say, and I can explain it too, but in your words, can you explain what emotional perfectionism is?
Mhm. So having the idea that you always need to be feeling like good or like neutral, like nothing less than neutral. And whenever you do feel something that's like unpleasant, I guess, judging yourself for that.
Yeah, exactly. So emotional perfectionism would be thinking that you should think or feel a certain way, and then resisting against anything you feel and shaming yourself or criticizing yourself if you're feeling something that you think you shouldn't be feeling. So what do you? Well, actually, let's back up a little bit. So it seems like there's been a variety of different content, or I know that there's been a variety of different content that you've struggled with, and by content I mean different themes of intrusive thoughts and that have shown up with a spike of anxiety and then given you the urge to do something to make them go away. So, can you speak to maybe some content areas that were easier or harder to work with? And then, in general, how you've gotten to this place of acceptance with most of your content areas?
Yeah. Um, I was actually thinking about this recently that um, like some really challenging content for me would be like sexual orientation, pedophilia, and harm OCD and relationship OCD, I think. Like all of those. And the just right OCD is a little bit easier for me. I think just because there's less shame around it, less shame that I put on myself.
Yeah, and just for the listeners, I'm just going to put some more words to the
Mhm.
different content areas that you're describing. So, harm OCD is preoccupation with the possibility that you might harm yourself or other people. Relationship OCD tends to be preoccupation with whether you're in the right relationship and either if you love your partner or or your partner loves you or both. Pedophilia OCD is preoccupation with whether or not you're going to hurt a child, particularly in a sexual way. um, what was the sexual orientation OCD tends to be is the preoccupation with what your sexual orientation is and its impact on your identity or your lifestyle. Um, and can you tell me what? Oh, and then not
And
just right
just right, yeah.
OCD. is when you're looking for a certain feeling. So this could be in the texture of what you're wearing or what you're touching or something like that that's more external. Not just right could also be something that you do mentally, but it's just cueing that you're not so concerned with a feared catastrophe occurring if you don't do a compulsion or an avoidance, but rather you just don't like the way that it feels. So what you're saying here is all those other content areas come as you have an intrusive thought about something like that. You also have the feeling of shame that makes it harder to accept that that thought is there. Where with something that has to do with not just right, you don't tend to feel shame about it. You just really want it to feel right.
Yeah.
Okay, so first, for all of the topics where you typically feel shame, can you talk about how you work through that shame and how you started accepting that those thoughts, it's okay for those thoughts to be there?
Hmm. Yeah. Um, so I guess most recently, I was struggling with the pedophilia themed OCD because I'm a teacher and I work with young children every day. So I would have an intrusive thought about like wanting to do something sexual with a student, and it would give me like a spike of anxiety, um, and like the urge to ruminate about it. Um, and yeah, oh, and I wanted to say another huge thing from coming from Huddle was learning what my compulsion was, because when I first learned about ERP, I knew that I was supposed to like expose myself to these things, like my intrusive thoughts, but I didn't know what the compulsion was that I was supposed to be like not doing. So
And in
learning
this
about my mental compulsions was a huge part of my recovery.
Great. So in this case, what was happening is you were having an unwanted thought about something you didn't like related to children. And then, probably because you were a teacher, you weren't able to then avoid the kids, which is something that a lot of people with those types of thoughts have. So then you were thinking, well, then what am I doing that's bringing this thought back? And then you started to learn that by ruminating or trying to figure out what the thought meant or why it was there, that's actually what was bringing the thought back. So it was a mental compulsion in the sense that you were trying to figure it out every time it arrived.
Yes.
Would you
Yeah,
say
I didn't
anything?
know that I
Yeah,
was doing that.
great. Yeah,
Mhm.
that and mental compulsions is a very common experience for people with OCD, and it is also something that most people don't notice that they're doing. But again, this is also common with worry. So with worry, it starts as an uncertain thought that and like kind of an unanswerable question. And then the second part of worry is your attempt to try to figure it out. So people who worry are constantly trying to figure out what the answer might be to the thing they're worried about, or trying to figure out why they're worrying in the first place. And that's what's keeping it going. So you can think about it like functionally similar in an unwanted intrusive thought, that you have an unwanted intrusive thought, it arrives with a spike of anxiety. You try to do something in your mind to make it go away. And in this case, it's trying to figure out why you had it in the first place. And the more you try to figure it out, the more stuck it gets. So once you realized that that was a compulsion, what'd you do differently once you had those intrusions?
So, well, what I would do is, I guess, yeah, whether it was like an incidental, is that what it's called?
An intentional exposure or an
Yeah,
incidental exposure. So
yeah,
that's thank you for cueing those words. I'll just explain. So an intentional exposure would be to say, I know that I'm going towards something that's going to be a trigger for me, and I'm going to intentionally plan to go towards it so that I can intentionally practice my new skill. And incidental exposure is something that just shows up in the context of your life, and you just got to be ready with your new strategy to do something effective.
mhm,
So, for
right.
you, whether it was intentional or
Mhm.
incidental, what was your strategy?
Yeah. So, yeah, either way, my strategy was to say to myself, I recognize that I'm having this thought and it's giving me these sensations. And I would like say to myself what they were. So sometimes it would be like butterflies in my stomach, or sometimes it would feel like my diaphragm like tightening. Or even sometimes I would have, or like often, I would have like a groinal sensation. So I would recognize all the sensations and the thought in my mind. And I would say to myself, so I'm going to let these thoughts and sensations be there. And then, like, the thing that I learned from you, Maggie, was to say full stop, because anything past the thought, it would be like me doing a compulsion and ruminating. So after having the thought, it would be like a full stop. This is what I need to recognize. And now I'm going to bring myself to the present moment. And the way that I did that was always like doing the five senses kind of like strategy. So I wouldn't even really count. Like, so I know that there's like the five things you see, four things, whatever, counting them. But I usually would just be like, this is what I see. This is what I smell. This is what I taste. This is what I feel. And this is what I hear in this moment, to bring myself back to the moment. And whenever the thought would come back or the sensations, I would try and just bring myself back to the present, and continuing to do that and just letting all of that be there.